G'day everyone, welcome to the How to Lancer tutorial part 2. My name's Andrew DFT, let's get started. So of course, when we left off in part 1, we started to build up some of the detail, adding the extra layers and really giving a depth and a 3D perspective into the prop, so that way it's not very flat and very linear. We want to give it as much detail as we can whilst keeping it simple so that you guys and beginners can follow along. So we won't waste too much time sitting and talking here, well, standing. But we'll jump in and we'll get started on all the cool detail to come. Alright, so obviously this image is from where we left off on part 2. We're going to go ahead now and add some more detail. So we'll break apart the template using this individual piece you can see here. Using the negative spacing, we'll transfer where it should actually sit relative on the foam itself. Once we've got this space locked in, we can break apart the template even further. We'll cut out this little square in the top left section of this design. Once that's transferred in, we'll start to break apart using the lines we can currently see on the template, and we'll cut them out so this template should be in two halves like this. Now we're going to transfer this little piece on, but what we're going to do is do it as one individual line. We're not going to close it off, so as you can see in the bottom left here, it doesn't actually go down vertically, it just sits there nice and tidy. Now what you can do is you can just simply freehand these little vertical or diagonal lines on, pretty much exactly what you can see on screen. Now we're grabbing the template again and we're going to start transferring more of this template design using the negative spacing, so that way we know exactly where it is because it is all sitting relative to each other, but it has a lot of space. So making sure we do go through, use that spacing correctly and transfer in all the lines that are required. If it doesn't make too much sense, all you really need to do is look at what's happening on screen and do it step by step. Now to make this a bit more 3D, we're going to get rid of this very 90 degrees shape we have here. So we're adding in this bevel line. You can see I've taken it all the way across the perimeter, and we'll now add the depth line, which will sit about halfway in between one of the layers of foam. So replicate what you can see on screen, and then very carefully using a nice sharp craft blade, we're going to bevel off this section here, going all the way down the foam, making sure you've got it well under control and you're not slipping and your fingers aren't anywhere near the blade. Make sure you keep that well in front, and you go through and you're doing all of the sections you can see here on screen and nothing extra. At this point we just want to do this top part. So obviously you can see here it comes out relatively nice. It might look a bit rough, but we'll change that in the end. And of course this is what it did look like as a 90-degree corner. Pretty big difference. So now we're going to start working on the front aspect of this gun. So what we'll do is we'll grab the template and then we'll transfer the negative space onto the foam, so that way we get this nice perimeter line so we know exactly where we're going to be working. And then what we'll do is we'll cut out the template and we'll separate it into two pieces along the guided line you can see there. Now what we're doing is adding in the edge line because we're going to bevel the foam just like we did with the top section a minute ago. So make sure you add that depth line in about halfway through one of the layers of foam, and then go ahead carefully using the blade and slice that off. So that way we have this nice rounded edge. Now what you're going to do is very carefully and take your time is transfer all these vertical lines you can see on the template onto the foam itself, being sure to wrap them around the beveled edge there, so that way they all sit in there rather nicely, and then adding in all the extra detail you can also see on that section of the template. Alright, so now what we'll do is we'll grab this section of the template marked on screen and we'll create two new layers from the foam, being sure to flip one side so that way we get a left and a right. Then what we'll do is we'll add a depth line because we don't actually need it to be this thick. It is a bit too thick for the section that we're wanting to add. So we'll add that depth line, but before we do any cutting, we'll actually carve out the internal section of the template, then transfer the negative spacing onto the design so that way we get that there. Now what you can do is you can go and cut the foam in half. We've done this many a times previously, so it shouldn't be too new for you unless you started on part 2 and skipped part 1, which is highly unlikely, but for those, you have a very interesting way of working tutorials. Nonetheless, cut that in half, and then what we do is use the template to mark where it goes, and then we'll glue it down into position like so. Nothing too difficult and all too easy. Now what you're going to do is you're going to cut out these little circles or elongated circles from the template itself. Then using the template's negative spacing you can transfer those circles into where they should sit on the foam, which is pretty easy. Do it nice and clean if you can, so that way it's not too messed about. Then what we're going to do is cut out this template even further, so that way we can see the extra layers that are on this piece. And by pieces I mean all these horizontal sections that we can see that are clearly marked out in the template. These do actually provide extra layers if you were to do them a bit more advanced, but because we are going to score these, we do need to make sure that they do sit well spaced and well within the template's design spacing. But now what we're doing is we're breaking apart the template even further with these individual sections you can see here on the screen. And what we're doing is we're slowly just transferring them into where they should sit. We're not going to add any higher raised sections, so we'll just keep them nice and simple. Applying them in, making sure they all sit horizontal. Adjust them if you need to with a ruler or something. But now what you're going to do is we're going to grab this little square section, cut it out of the template so it's freestanding, and transfer that onto 2 sections of foam. Once we've got that, you can then give a depth line about halfway through the foam and then simply cut it out. We don't want it to be this thick, so making it a lot thinner is going to allow us to have a more cohesive design, as the majority of the detail we've added so far is at that half thickness, not the full thickness of the default foam. Then using the template you can cut the, draw in the square sections. Once you've done that, we'll simply glue this into place. It should be clearly marked out because we also transferred that in with the templates earlier, so it shouldn't be too hard to find where it goes. And as a good designer once said, on to the next piece. I don't know who said that, I just made that up on the spot. But on to the next piece. We're going to cut out this little section that sits up top here out of the template and then simply slot it in above everything we've just done, tracing out where it should actually be. Then using a craft blade we can go in and actually cut out the internal section so we have this middle part looking nice and free, and very carefully, it's going to be a bit awkward because the foam is a bit flimsy, is trace out that internal segment so that way it sits there nice and clean and will provide us with some nice detail when we score it. Now just like we did before, we're going to do it again, something very similar. We're going to cut out this little square section and create 2 new pieces from the foam, but unlike before we're going to leave it at its full thickness. So before we get there you can go ahead and draw in the internal square segments. You can do that freely, you don't need to use the template, and you can judge how thick or how small you want those internal perimeter lines to be, and then you can simply just glue it into position. You don't need to cut it in half or anything, just leave it at its full default thickness. Now using this front little section template, we're going to just go ahead and add in all these vertical lines just to finish it off. So we're pretty much just doing 2 vertical pen lines up in that segment that you can currently see. That's it. You don't need to do anything else, we'll just leave it at that. And that of course wraps up a lot of the major pieces of detail that we need to do and have done. Now we can start moving on to scoring. Now if you're not familiar with scoring, the technique behind it is you use a craft blade or a knife or whatever to carve the top skin of the foam, so to speak. We're not carving all the way through the foam, we're not even carving a decent way through the foam. We're just breaking the seam of the surface to separate the line and the foam itself. So that way when we provide heat via a heat gun, it should separate those lines and give us a very clear, distinct piece of detail. So what you're going to do is very carefully and patiently go across all the lines we've currently drawn on this design with the pen and score them. That is a lot of lines, I know, and it's going to be on both sides, but it is something key and it's something very important. So do go through it. It took me about 20 to 25 minutes to actually go through this, so that's a reference for you. But once you've done all those lines, we can then grab a heat gun and slowly go all over it, giving it a bit of a heat over. You don't want to hold it too close that it burns. Just a nice heat over it and you'll see all those lines start to separate. And of course, you'll eventually get it looking like this. And it's a definite contrast to what it was a few minutes ago. So if you can get it looking like that, that's perfect and that's what you're aiming for. If it didn't separate as well as that, that means you haven't held the heat gun to it long enough, so give it a go. If you want, I recommend maybe trying on a scrap piece of foam. Okay, so to finish off this part 2 of the tutorial, we'll go ahead and we'll quickly build the butt section of the gun. The stock, or the part that meets the shoulder to help with your aim. What we'll do is we'll grab the template, we'll break it apart, we'll grab this little section marked on screen, and we'll create 2 new sections out of the foam, being sure to flip it so you have a left and a right. Then we'll grab the negative section of the template so we know exactly where the new pieces we just carved will sit nice and horizontally. But before we get any further, we'll go ahead and start breaking apart the template even further and slowly transferring the negative space, those guidelines, onto it, because these will of course be scoring marks that we'll do later on. So once we've transferred all that on, we have the detail sitting there nicely, we'll start working on those new sections we just did. We will break apart the template of that nice little piece and we'll start transferring it across. We'll start with the horizontal line sitting at the bottom, and then we'll add a depth line about 3/4 of the way through the foam towards the grated or textured side of that slab of foam, I guess. Then what you do is grab a nice sharp craft blade and we'll go ahead and bevel it, so that way it gives it a nice little slope like that to give it a bit more of a 3D look and a perspective. Do that on the other side, so that way both left and the right should look identical. Now what we'll do is we'll cut along this stepped line and we'll transfer that onto the foam, and we'll actually cut this whole section out. The reason we want to do this is we want to give it a nice little terraced effect. So once you've cut that out, you can then add a depth line about halfway through that individual piece, and then we can just go ahead and cut it right out. As you can see here, I'm cutting along that depth line, which I didn't actually show in the tutorial, my apologies, but you've done it enough now so you should be able to just go ahead and do that without actually having a visual aid. Once we've cut it out, we'll use the actual good side, not the textured cutoff, and we'll glue it back into position, but with a slanted step, so that way it does give us that nice little terraced effect, or stepped edge as the official design term. Once that's all set, using the of course the guidelines that we put in earlier, we can just glue it straight into place and shouldn't have any issues. Before we progress or glue everything together, we'll quickly score the lines on both the left and the right hand side, and then we'll glue both of these slabs together so it's sitting there nicely. If you need to clean up some of the edges, do so now, but otherwise then you can grab your heat gun and we start heating up this section, so that way all the detail starts to come through from the scored lines we did earlier. Then once that's all nice and cooled down, we can then grab our art cement or our bonding agent and we can glue these things together, making sure you get it nice and symmetrical, nice and straight. We don't want any weird bends to it. If you find that the seam isn't fully filled and you want to add some more durability, you can of course go and refill that segment, and then pretty much that leaves us with what we have here. The gun pretty much almost done. All we need to do is do some final touch-ups in part 3 of course, and some few little techniques to help seal it all together. So that's it. That's enough information for part 2. We went over a lot of different types of detail and ways to create it, from cutting the foam in half to adding extra layers to actually going through and scoring, heating up the foam and getting that detail that way. You've already noticed that it does really start to bring out a lot of cool little features, and it's an easy way to achieve detail without having to add or subtract all these individual layers. You can paint them up, add depths and shadows if you wanted to give it kind of a similar effect. But we're starting to learn some pretty cool and unique techniques. So I think that's enough talking for one video. Go ahead, click on part 3, let's get this finished. Thank you very much for watching guys, catch you later.